Hey everyone, today we're going to be talking about The Great Gatsby, just giving a really short, brief intro to the novel, which I'm really excited for this term. If you haven't noticed, it's one of my favourite novels. I think it's so short, it's only like 120 or so pages. I'm probably wrong, don't quote me on that. But there is just so much in those words, in those very few pages. When you read Fitzgerald's prose, it's almost like poetry sometimes, and you can read things multiple ways, which makes it really, really interesting for discussion. Of course, I also love, Leo's portrayal, which is also a really great film by Baz Luhrmann, Australian director, of The Great Gatsby, which hopefully we'll have time to watch. One thing about The Great Gatsby I want to warn you about is the first chapter is really hard. Like, I find the first chapter a bit boring, so please don't be put off. The first chapter is a bit tricky, but once you get past that, trust me, you'll be fine. Another thing about The Great Gatsby, my personal experience, I read it in year 12, so I would have been 17, 18. And to be honest, I hated it. I couldn't get into the novel. I found it boring. I was like, why is this a classic? And then I read it again last year, and it just kind of changed my life and my perception. I thought, wow, I'd never thought of it as such an amazing, beautiful piece of literature before. So even if you don't love it now, there's hope for you in the future. Yes, so on The Great Gatsby, I'm going to be doing various formative tasks, which will generally involve you reading the chapter and doing some form of questions or analysis of the chapter. Please aim to do at least 75% of these formative tasks. I'll be keeping track on who's done the chapter questions and who hasn't. And if you haven't done enough, I'll be asking questions why you aren't doing the formative work. And you say, oh, it's formative, it's not for marks. I mean, if you do the formative work, it makes the summative work easier. That is the theory. So you're actually doing yourself a favour. Moving on, bit about the sort of historical, personal context of Fitzgerald. There he is. I know he's another sort of dead white man, literature figure, but at least he's more newly dead than, let's say, Shakespeare. So he was from upper middle class Minnesota, educated at Princeton University. He wrote 4 novels, 4 collections of short stories during his lifetime, and died at 44. This lovely woman here is Geneva King. She's sort of like Fitzgerald's muse, if you like, and a lot of people like to think she was an inspiration for the character of Daisy. Notably, she was part of Chicago's Big Four. This sort of related to the debutantes, so the kind of high-profile young women in the social scene during World War One, and they were described as the 4 most attractive and socially desirable young women in Chicago. So obviously you could imagine how anyone would want someone like Fitzgerald would want one of the Big Four, and it's obviously, if you know the story of The Great Gatsby, it'll make sense, but Fitzgerald once said, poor boys shouldn't think of marrying rich girls. And over here we've got Zelda Fitzgerald, looking very fancy. She's sort of his other muse. He had various women and wives, so she initially rejected him because he didn't have enough money to support her as a writer, and she was also in the social scene, a socialite. She became an icon due to her vivacious nature and sort of luxurious lifestyle, as we can see. They had a pretty turbulent marriage, fraught with the great things like alcoholism, violence, and, economic hardship, and she also had, just a good measure, mental health issues. So it was kind of one of those high-profile, traumatic kind of full-on relationships. So you can see where The Great Gatsby has come from in terms of Fitzgerald's personal life and his sort of place in the social scene and his personal relationships as well. Moving on to more broadly, this is definitely broad, so please don't take this as a history lesson, but it was written in 1925, I think, or 24, around then. It was definitely published then. And it was sort of the post-World War One prosperity of America. So, Americans were seen as somewhat the heroes of World War One, sort of. So this led to a somewhat luxurious lifestyle, which obviously led to the Great Depression in the 1930s. So everyone went a bit crazy after World War One in the West. It was also known as the Roaring Twenties, a very glamorous decade. Also, importantly, the Jazz Age was around this time in the 20s, and apparently Fitzgerald coined this term. But obviously we know that the jazz movement originated in America, in New York. Generally a black African American movement as well. It was also the age of prohibition. If you've seen those gangster movies, alcohol was illegal. So there was things like bootlegging, the illegal importation and distribution of alcohol, which is funny because there were so many parties going on, but apparently, alcohol was illegal. Flappers, the women, began to challenge traditional gender roles. So I know it's a funny word, but they were women who behaved in a way that was, inappropriate by the older generation standards. They drank, smoked, wore short dresses, revealing clothing, all the fun things. And also in this age, cars were a thing. They were becoming a very prominent thing, in fact, more so. So Henry Ford, launching of the automobiles, radically changed, society, and so on. Ah, yes, it was published in 1925. So amidst all these things going on, here is a video, 1920s culture, of Gatsby. It's really interesting. I'm not going to show it because it is 5 minutes long, but I suggest searching it on YouTube if you've got the time. If you want to learn a bit more about the context, go for it. And that's all about sort of short snippet of Great Gatsby. I'm really looking forward to reading it with you guys and talking about it in class.